And when we started doing this Hyperblast kind of individual review format, it is with records like this that we had in mind. The new Metallica album, 72 Seasons. Their 11th overall, which is remarkably few for a band of their vintage. But with the gaps that they have, is why Metallica albums, I think, are still kind of events. It's been a week of us digesting this record, and so, everyone has had their say on it in the meantime. Although something that we were discussing in the kind of the host chat, it hasn't felt quite as relentless this time out in terms of just opening up your social media and seeing what people are talking about. Particularly on the release Friday, I was shocked at how casually people were talking about it. And in my head, I think I have gone maybe 15 years after Death Magnetic and like a new generation of Metallica fans got a thrash record from them for the first time, a path from which they haven't deviated very much. Our third, 70-something minute record from them in that vein, in a row, in that time. Maybe the younger people who tend to be the most heatedly discussing things on social media, they're maybe more excited about, Turnstile and Spirit Box and Sleep Token and all these things, don't actually care enough about new Metallica to make it a hot topic.
I mean, I saw a fair bit of people kind of like dropping their hot takes and then moving on pretty quickly from it, but it felt like it was kind of like that was it. It was like, listen to the album once, drop your hot take, onto the next thing. No one was kind of like actually digesting the album and kind of spending time with it. So I think that is it. I think a lot of people are just that audience who are going to be on Twitter kind of posting their hot takes and things aren't going to be sticking around to spend the time with a 70-minute, the third, fourth if you count Lulu, like excessively long Metallica album in a row.
Well, I think in this case, Metallica are kind of victims of their own good run, because you've got to remember, before Hardwired, it was like Lulu, Lords of Summer, the movie that no one liked, the festivals that failed. It was a bunch of stuff that didn't seem to go down that well, but always warranted discussion. So when Hardwired came out, and it was mostly good, and often great, and there was just a touring cycle where they were just reliable, like reliably good, not necessarily surprising, but just great wherever they went. It kind of felt like expectations settled kind of in a better place than they were before Hardwired. But that doesn't really invite all that much discussion.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think, most of the younger people who are into heavy music right now, again, they're the people who are going to see like Knocked Loose at Coachella or whatever. I don't think they're looking to Metallica anymore. Most of the people who I've seen really talking about this record are people who I follow, older than us, who grew up with Metallica being the benchmark. And honestly, I think that's pretty healthy. Like, when I see young people just completely disregarding Metallica and going, ugh, I don't like Metallica, they're for dads, I do feel disappointed in them because, come on, but I don't think 72 Seasons has to be the most spoken about release of the year just because it's Metallica. It's probably healthy for an album of this nature to just fall into where it should be. Like, this is not an album that the fate of Metallica hangs on one iota. Even less than last time, for some of the reasons that you're saying, Elliot. Because, I mean, like, someone posed a question in our Discord that I think is well worth asking here. How do you think the previous Metallica album, Hardwired Self-Destruct, is and will be remembered? Not your own personal opinion on it, but when it comes to the generally perceived Metallica account. What's Hardwired's place in history?
Like, I do kind of feel like other people doing it. It's the return to form album after the dark years of like I know obviously Death Magnetic was the return to form album after the dark years, and then like
how many dark years are we talking?
Yeah, like, but this is it's they did Saint Anger, and then there was nothing, and then Death Magnetic was they're a thrash band again, and then they did Lulu, and they did like say a movie and festivals, and they didn't want to be when they were playing festivals they didn't want to be at their festival, they didn't want to be booking metal bands, so it was kind of like and then Hardwired is they're a thrash band again, and everyone just kind of went with it. And like Hardwired, I think is, like I say, great album with some fairly sizable problems, but for the most part is it's what you'd want a modern Metallica record to sound like. So I think because it was seen as this kind of like this was the latest in the return to form albums, people are going to look on it fondly.
I think it was the record where Metallica kind of stopped being embarrassing, because in the previous years, I mean, all the stuff I've listed, but I don't know, their live shows started to lose it a bit. They kind of felt like they were aging quite rapidly between like 2011 and 2015. So for Hardwire to come out and feature a few genuine, modern classics for that band, and not have a really garish production job that people could immediately point at and say, that stupid, not have these ridiculous flights of fancy, which, you know, the more curmudgeon fans could just dismiss right out the gate. It felt like Metallica what did I just call them? It felt like Metallica were kind of back on track, in a sense. Like, not a return to form in the way that we talked about something like Firepower a couple of years ago, where everyone went, this is the best Judas Priest album in 30 years. But Metallica putting out records that, you know, people liked and people wanted to see the songs live, which wasn't really a novelty, which maybe not a novelty now, but was definitely a novelty at the time.
Yeah, I think it will be probably regarded as their best album of the 21st century. And it's not my choice. Like, I prefer Death Magnetic. And I know a lot of people my age do as well, because that was our Metallica album, and I think it is more consistent overall. But Death Magnetic has the infamous production issues, and also, being the one where they went back to their roots for the first time, it's also the one that some people point out as having ended a particular era of Metallica where, even if they weren't making great records, they were at least going by completely their own rules. And I know obviously after that is when you get Lulu and stuff like that, which contradict what I've just said, but those feel like more like weird deviations than the main Metallica canon. It feels like Death Magnetic is like, sometimes people say that it's the first record where they started just going, let's do what people want from us, I guess, rather than the constant fuck you, we're going to do whatever. And those kind of eras, the Black Album through to Saint Anger, is a relentless period of restless creativity for Metallica. Separate, of course, to the period that marked their 80s records. But whether you're a fan of those works or not, the Black Album redefined what a thrash metal band could be. The late 90s, between like the Load records, Garage Inc., S&M, all collectively kind of broke open the confines of what a metal band was expected to be. With Saint Anger, it obviously hit a wonky point that led them to finally go, okay, back to the drawing board, what was Metallica originally about again? And since Death Magnetic, we have been in phase 3 of Metallica, which is kind of variations on a theme, right? Like the one where they just sound like metal's ultimate elder statesman. Hardwired, I think, between the kind of improved sonic listenability from Death Magnetic, the songs like Moth into Flame and Spit Out the Bone that many people point out as being the best since their classic eras, as you were saying, Elliot, the successful touring cycle and so on, it kind of put whatever, you know, Lulu's behind them, just said Metallica are back. I think that will end up being the collective winner in people's memory. Even with the horrendous album cover, which I think is the point which is embarrassing, which this one continues because it's a tangent that we don't have time to go on right now, but it is such a shame that the biggest metal band in the world have such awful taste in visuals. Like, you should have the self-respect and decency to look cool and just be a cool metal band in that regard.
They do that with their merch, though, don't they? You know, like, we still get Metallica merch that's like skeletons and stuff.
Have you seen the 72 Seasons merch line? It's ugly as fuck.
Oh, no, for this one, but I know they have it in them to, you know, that's a gnarly skeleton on a t-shirt.
Not very often, but regardless of that,
a Metallica t-shirt that's a gnarly skeleton.
And I guess because of the fact that this record has not made any of the mad decisions that they might have made in another time, I think 72 Seasons is maybe the most redundant record in Metallica's canon in terms of what actual meaning it might hold for them, right? Like, it's not going to be the late career high that got them back on track. That's happened. It's not a wild creative swing that takes them to kind of questionable terrain. That's happened. Even if it was to end up being their swan song record, which with bands of this age who make records as infrequently as Metallica do is always a possibility, I think it'd just be the final one in the return to traditional metal era that started with Death Magnetic and hit its popular peak on Hardwired to Self-Destruct. 72 Seasons in a nutshell doesn't really matter, unless you are just like deeply involved with what continued statements Metallica might make. And that's the only position to come at this from. And that's not an unrewarding thing to make clear. Like, certainly for James, this probably feels like one of the most important records that he's made because he's been to rehab, he's kind of, you know, his public wrestling with insecurities, and then the kind of conceptual idea that he's come out of that with of 72 Seasons, the first 18 years of life and how they set you up as the kind of person you're going to be going forward, which probably for him means as much thinking about, you know, his parents and his childhood as much as it does the kind of fuck yeah, falling in love with heavy metal Lux Eterna stuff. There is interesting art that can be found in something like this. It's just not going to be the most vital, game-changing metal record of the year. And there has been the usual hyperbole from some areas of the press. It's their best album in years. It's some of their hardest-hitting material ever. Whatever. I don't care. What is there to be gleaned from this record as Metallica fans in this stage of their career? Can I probably speak for all of us, maybe, when I say that this is my least favourite of the 3-album Back to Roots run that we're on with Metallica?
I need to revisit Death Magnetic because it's been a while since I've listened to that to kind of like say if I prefer Death Magnetic to this or not. So, like, I'll put a pin in that one. But I don't think that's an unreasonable statement.
I don't think this record has necessarily the highs of either Death Magnetic or Hardwired Self-Destruct, but I would say it might be the most consistent throughout of any of those records. And I think for Metallica, that does count for a lot in terms of enjoyment, because on both those records, they both have songs which I think are modern classics for the band. Are there songs on here that I would call modern classics? Not necessarily sure, but there's at least... I don't think there's necessarily a song on here where I go, that's a definite skip every single time, like there are on
Like
the
Man
last
Unkind.
two. Yeah, like Man Unkind, or like Suicide and Redemption, or there's been a couple on the last few records where I just go, I will never willfully listen to that unless I just can't be bothered to hit the skip.
I think me and you might have some different opinions on this record. I think this record is certainly consistent in one way, maybe not the way that you're using it there. I think the difference here is I think this is noticeably weaker than Hardwired to Self-Destruct, whereas Hardwired and Death Magnetic, I think you could make a case for either of them. I go Death Magnetic, but like I said, there are things that Hardwired does as well. But in my outlook, I am able to just take the things I really like from this record at this stage in their career while recognising the major problems. I think in one way you could call this like the reload to Load in relation to Hardwired, like where Load was a massive record with a great deal of variety and mostly excellent songwriting, and then Reload has like a few real high watermarks that are classic Metallica, but you can mostly see that it's the less good tracks that were left. Obviously, these have 7 years separating them rather than one, so the analogy works less well there, but they're similar enough in style while being, I guess, disparate enough to continue quality for me to at least say something like that. Lux Eterna really excited me as a single, even if I didn't necessarily expect the whole record to sound like that, but to hear them come out with a 3-minute single like that is all retro heavy metal playing, but with a real rocket up its arse. Obviously, in relation to the 72 Seasons concept, that got us wondering whether it was going to be a record of just like super old school, back to the garage, teenagers playing together for the first time. I don't think that is, evidently what this is in approach. This Metallica, I would say, sounds very, very comfortable to the point of sounding like they're not in a hurry to get anywhere or do anything, while James, over the top of that, kind of processes the results of his therapy and everything else over that. And I mean, it's funny. It sounds like there's been no tension in the band during the making of this, which is nice on a personal level. It's like the polar opposite of Saint Anger, where Saint Anger is like the extreme height of tensions within the band, where they make this record that ends up feeling like a necessary excising of all of these things that were going wrong at the time for them to be able to make it through this. And this sounds like there has been so little friction that it sounds very, very unhurried.
Yeah, I think comfortable is a really kind of like good word, because that is a sound of this record. It is, they're not pushing themselves necessarily. They're not, there's no friction. There doesn't feel like there's anything that's like hanging over this record to kind of be like, oh, this was outside of James's personal sort of things, which he was processing. It feels like the band are just kind of like, let's just make a bunch of metal tunes. I think some of what you said, I think, is a little harsh, because I there are definite problems, and I do agree. A chunk of this record does sit in that mid-paced slog, where like some of these songs I'm be like, oh, this is quite lethargic and tiresome. But I mean, particularly in the sort of the back half of the record, I really come to like this record where I think it comes to life more. Lux Eterna, as I said, I love that as lead single. That is like a shot of adrenaline into this record after a kind of like plodding, slightly tiresome and lethargic first 30 minutes, and then Luxon hits, and then I think that momentum actually carries through a bunch of the songs, and that's where I get my excitement from this record.
For me, I understand the comparison, saying that there's, because it's sort of more mid-tempo, a bit slower, that it's sort of like Man Unkind, Murder One, those sort of songs. For me, one of the things that makes a Metallica record great, and maybe the key ingredient, is, do the band sound confident? Do they sound self-assured? And that might be sort of perceived as comfortable. I'm sure Metallica are very comfortable making this record, and sometimes I think that works against their favour. I do think there are 2 or 3 songs on here that I think really suffer from being a bit sort of languid, but hearing Metallica sound totally in command of their music and their performance and their songwriting and that sort of thing, I think that goes a long way to selling the mid-tempo songs, and even some of the songs that maybe on paper aren't as great as something like a Luxor Turner. I think hearing, especially Hetfield, but hearing the interplay among the members and hearing that level of confidence, I don't think they've had it in a long time. It's sort of comparable to Hardwired, but Death Magnetic for me, maybe the real problem with that record is it sounds like a kind of nervous band. Metallica don't sound confident in that record, even though they wrote some great songs on it. On this album, even the lesser songs, I think, are sold by super commanding performances, particularly from James, who I presume we all agree is the man of the match this time around.
What you're saying, I agree with James. There are parts of this record where I really don't hear that, and I do feel that more tentative feeling. Of the singles after Luxor Turner, we only spoke about Screaming Suicide on the show, but I said about that song posing maybe the more realistic bar for the record than expecting like a whole, Goes Like Gangbusters, Luxor Turner experience. In context, those singles I think do jump out as some of the highlight moments. I like the title track a lot, even if it takes a while to kind of get into it, setting out the stall early for some slightly redundant intros, but I like that riff in the way I like most Hetfield riffs, right? Like it speaks a familiar language to me, but that hits immediately. James's vocal lines are immediately catchy on it, and that chorus, the big "Wrath of Man," that is one of the few moments on the record that taps into a kind of higher register of like intensity and urgency, which makes you think about Spit Out the Bone and tunes like that. Which is on this record, I think that's a more isolated moment of really hitting that kind of full steam ahead.
I think the opening. I think it's a really good opener. I'm with you on the redundant intros. So 172 Seasons doesn't actually bother me as much because it feels kind of just like the album revving up.
Yeah, no, again, I like the sort of Motorhead feel on it and stuff. It just maybe takes
to hit that.
It's like a minute rather than fucking 20 seconds as it should be. But
some of the later songs do really run into that problem where they do take too long to get that. But I think at least on this one they kind of build it, and then you get the riff comes in, and then he tweaks the riff slightly, and it's just proper like classic Hetfield riffing, and I'm cool with that. And when you get him coming with the feeding on the wrath of man, like I'm like, there we go. Like Hetfield is going for it. I think I'm with you, Elliot. I think he is the man of the match here. I think he's like, even on the less good songs, there's stuff to like with what Hetfield's doing, because again, just his commanding presence, he's sort of really assured in his vocals, and it just carries through. And I think like the title track as an opener is one of his like stronger vocal performances because it's got a bit of aggression to it. There's a couple of other ones where it comes again throughout the record, but I think it does really set the first part of the record off. It kind of then immediately stumbles a little bit for me once you get past 72 Seasons.
Okay, I was slightly harsh on Screaming Suicide, and it's not electrifying, but it is fun. I think like the pace isn't all there, but for like a practice room jam session type song, which is kind of what it sounds like, from kind of Kirk's Wah at the start, the new ever British heavy metal riff, like I am in the portion of Metallica's fan base that likes Saxon, which that riff sounds like, so I'm into it. And then again, James's vocal lines and the verses are great. It is like it doesn't necessarily have like a proper chorus, but like it's another example of Metallica sounding the liveliest when the tunes are more outright fun. I'm surprised to hear you say that hitting a stumbling block after 70 Seasons, because Shadows Follow, which is track 2, is for me again certainly upper half on the record. That riff fucks, and that's like the main thing I want from Metallica now. Like these songs that feel like a bunch of guys having genuine fun playing metal together.
Problem is, I think it's the sequencing, because I think that song Shadows Follow coming right after 72 Seasons, they feel really similar, and I don't know, I
don't think so, because 72 Seasons is more of a thrash song, whereas Shadows Fall is more of like a Black Album type feel. Reminds me of like a Wolf and Man and stuff like that.
Shadows Follow for me, as a second track, that felt like the perfect follow-up to that opener, because it's kind of tighter, a bit more succinct, sort of quicker into it. It's obviously still has the elongated intro. You're always going to get that with Metallica nowadays. But I remember when 72 Seasons came out as a song, as a single, and when it ended with that feeding on the wrath of man, bow, and my head just did Holier Than Thou straight into it afterwards.
Yeah.
And this has a very similar way of kicking it off. So when that came in, it was sort of just innately satisfying in that sense.
Yeah.
It was like, my worry was that, we might lose the pace rapidly. Like they might go into something really slow, really quickly, and that would make it a real stumble. But for me, those two songs as a 1-2, I'm still not that keen on Screaming Suicide, but as a 1-2, I think it really sets the stall out for this record in a very promising way, which, people might not think it delivers on, but for me, it keeps this record exciting on repeated listens.
Yeah, Shadows Follow. I think there's a pre-chorus riff in there that sounds right out of Iron Maiden's Wrathchild, like the and I find it really endearing at the moment when you can hear Metallica's like pre-thrash heavy metal influences come out in their riffs. The way that Lux Eterna had that like Diamond Head on a Motorhead drum part, or going back to Atlas Rise from Hardwired, which similarly had that kind of new wave of British heavy metal feel, like locked into a crunchy Metallica format. Shadows Fall, I think really works. Also has maybe some of the most full-on Papa Het moments with "Never Can I Stop Because the Beast is Hungry," and like I think if you are talking Man of the Match on this record, I think it's so obviously James Hetfield. We've all come to that conclusion individually, and I think it's vocally more than riffing even because if you're going to be drawn to something of interest on this album, it's him on the mic, like both in his actual vocal line sounding like the most kind of fired up punkin' attitude element of the sound, but his lyricism as well, which is easily like the most confessional he's been on one of these kind of phase 3 Metallica records, going back to some of that kind of load attitude of content and stuff like that. I think it gets overlooked because his language is so often like quite cheesy heavy metal, but he's really thoughtful about what he puts down on paper, and I think the overall direction of this album is a good example where, when he's singing about his shadows following him, doing that "beast is hungry," like it's coming from somewhere real, and Screaming Suicide has some really direct lines in it, and then drawing these kind of recent experiences he's had back to that time of his youth as the concept deals with, and you get stuff like the title track and Chasing Light. It's if you are a diehard interested in the people in Metallica, I think James gives you more to chew on this than he has done. I mean, certainly since St. Anger was a mental thing that it was, in a more coherent way since Load and Reload.
Yeah, and he manages to frame quite cheesy plaudits in a way that's like genuinely enjoyable and doesn't feel out of place on a Metallica record. Like, the whole thing, no matter how I run, my shadows will follow me. You can imagine that in a sort of cursive font on a middle-aged woman's Facebook page. It's not too out of the remit of that, but somehow, I don't know if it's his performance or being backed by the Metallica machine, he sells it to me, and throughout, it makes this a bit more of a maybe an emotionally invested record than what they've done in a long time. And maybe I'm mistaking that for quality, I don't know. But like you say, if you're interested in the people in Metallica, it's a fascinating insight into the guy over 40 years into his career.
I think there's a great balance between the sort of the Hetfieldisms of his like vocal delivery and like the way he'll do things, which are kind of like cheesy trademarks that everyone kind of likes to imitate. But he does them, but in a way that lyrically and kind of his delivery actually feels more sincere, rather than him just doing his kind of trademark like family, like those sort of things. When he's doing that for these sort of lines, they actually sound quite genuine, but he's James Hetfield doing it, so he's gonna sing it that way. And I think in a way it makes him sound a little bit I guess more sophisticated and classier than they have done in some like the previous Metallica records, where he's fully laying into that, because there is a more confessional, honest approach to his lyricism this time.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna put a pin in that idea in terms of the emotive side of Metallica, because I think that is the area where it comes through. The thing I'm let down by on this record overall is variety, and how variety leads into sequencing, and that's odd because that's something that Metallica have never really had a problem with before. Like, this album feels much longer to me than either Hardwired or Death Magnetic before it, because of how samey the material is. Where I think we can all agree that Hardwired Self-Destruct is too long. Like, it shouldn't have been a double album. But if you are going track by track on it, there is a broad range of feels and tones that are covered in that album. And that's why I mentioned the kind of Man, Unkind and Murder ones, because in the context of that record, they're lows, but they are the points where the record deviates to something like that. This put a bunch of songs that feel like that in a row. And then Death Magnetic, I think it often gets viewed as like the ear fatigue one from the mix. But if you look at the run in the middle of that record, like when we were talking about the sides earlier, Broken, Beat and Scarred, The Day That Never Comes, All Nightmare Long, Cyanide, and The Unforgiven 3, those are all very different songs. Like, maybe Broken, Beat and Scarred and Cyanide have some similarities, but like, this record never thinks to build something like A Day That Never Comes. It's genuinely quite odd, because they always would. And for me, it's Sam, you mentioned like Lux Eterna picking up the record and it continuing on from there. For me, it's the two pairs of songs that are either side of Lux Eterna.
The two before Lux Eterna that really...
those two, and then the two that follow Lux Eterna.
See, I quite like Chasing Light. I think Chasing Light's pretty good, actually.
That's when I start to drift off and kind of wonder where I am. So, like, Sleepwalk My Life Away, It's okay. Again, it's got that kind of bass intro. It's cool to hear Rob Trujillo kind of put on such display on this record. Like, no wonder he thinks it's the best one. But it is a Man Unkind riff, innit? And it is as long as Fade to Black without really deviating from that one sort of riff feel.
It feels very
much.
Black Album, but kind of like latter album track Black Album, where it's not going to be anyone's favourite. Same with that and You Must Burn, You Must both have that kind of like that Black Album stomp and heft, but without actually having the same level of actual power to it. So it just feels a bit languid. Like,
I'm not sure I agree with this assessment of Sleep Mortal My Life Away, because I understand the comparison. It's a sort of Man Unkind or Murder One style riff, but for me, the problem with those songs isn't necessarily that the riff's not that all that compelling or not got all that much in it. I mean, I think the Murder One riff is pretty terrible, but I think it's only exacerbated by the fact that they didn't really write a song around it. And I think on every song on this record, with the exception of one, which we might get to later, they've written a song around the riff, which I know sounds like a strange plaudit to give fucking Metallica.
Yeah, I think that the comparison I'm drawing isn't so much that part. It's, I mean, Man Unkind, I think, does that. But the problem is there's a lack of pace and urgency in it, and it just feels a little bit like languid and lumpen, as Sam put it there. And I think, again, I'm not putting every one of these songs in this little run on the same bracket. I think of these 4 songs we're about to talk about, I think Sleep My Life Away is one of the higher end ones. For me, you were saying earlier about there's not a moment that's like a total skip. I think You Must Burn is that on this record, because it's like Sad But True if it wasn't heavy and was several minutes longer. I think that one is pretty much a non-starter. Like, that is cut that one completely on the record.
Yeah, I mean, with the case of You Must Burn, I like the chorus, and the sort of Alice in Chains midsection is pretty cool. The riff is forgettable, and I do think this is one of the songs where it's really obvious that it's too long, because the thing with Metallica is it's easy to go, oh, make it shorter, but sometimes it's hard to say what exactly you would cut or where you'd move things, But with this one, listening to it, there were long sections of you going, this could all just go. We could have gotten to this so much faster. We don't need this slow intro, yada yada. If it just increased the BPM just by even 5, it would have a bit more pace to it and a bit more energy. And I think the song really does suffer from that. And again, being 7 minutes, it's one of the longer ones. So for me, this is one of the dips. I wouldn't say this is the worst song on the record. That comes later. But
really, this is the low point for me.
Yeah,
this
I think it's definitely the low.
This is like decent, but it is by far the weakest moment, and that's why Lux Eterna coming in straight after is such a lift for me. And that does that might be what carries me through the rest of the record, is the high I get from Lux Eterna coming off the back of this every time and just being like, right, it's go time.
Yeah, I think You Must Burn is one of those parts where there are parts on this record that, what you were saying, Elliot, about kind of how, like, on Death Magnetic they might not sound confident on that, whatever. I think on this there are parts where they just feel the most like they have gotten a little
Complacent,
yeah. Like, in terms of how lacking in spark it is. And I think You Must Burn is the most obvious example of, like, front to back 7 minutes of song. It never gains any spark, really. I think, again, on the slightly higher end of this sort of mid-album lull, like Along with Sleep Walk My Life Away, I think Crown of Barbed Wire is like a decent groove. I think it would feel better if it was like the song that went for the feel on that album, rather than being in this run of like a bunch of samey stuff like that. And then you mentioned Chasing Light. I think that for me is another lower one as well, that's just not all that exciting. And I think on a Metallica album, you should look at something like Crown of Barbed Wire being like the low ceiling of quality, right, to get a good average going. Instead, there's like 3 or 4 on this that it's better than.
I think Crown of Barbed Wire is the worst song on this record, comfortably. For me,
really?
if there is like a real dud on this record, it's this. And it's the thing I said earlier. For me, there's no real chorus, no real verse, barely any structure. The riff, I'm not all that compelled by it. So you don't even get this sort of
I
jam
like the riffs
quality.
on this. Like...
Oh, no, it's just sort of sour and lumping and unpleasant. And to be honest, like, I wouldn't mind Metallica sitting on a riff for a long time, or, not necessarily being bound to a structure. They've done that before. But when what you're getting is already so lumpen and unexciting, this was one where the runtime, I really felt it, which is bad because it's one of the shorter songs. Like, it's 5.5 minutes or so. And after 2 minutes, I was like, we're still on this one idea. Like, I know there's a lot of Saint Anger defenders out there, and for me, the problem with that record isn't necessarily the production. It's just, it felt like they didn't hone anything into a song. And this has that sort of condition, and it really bothers me.
I think what we're saying here is we seem to disagree on which songs are the low points or whatever, but either way, there's a chunk in the middle of this fucking record of loads of songs that all go in that just a da-na-na-na-na kind of pace, and it's too much, and none of them are great. None of them are real standouts on the record, and they are lacking, I think, the colour and texture that Metallica might have brought to similar things in the past. I think there's good Hetfield stuff in those songs. Like, he's doing his best, bless him, to try and make You Must Burn interesting. I think you mentioned the kind of woozy, like, AIC bits you get in Sleep On My Like Way or whatever, and I think hearing that kind of influence that you most associate with, like, the Load years in this more back to heavy metal phase is interesting. Are they gripping songs? Not particularly. And I think what happens in that 4-song run either side is, as Sam is saying, Lux Eterna really slaps you awake in that portion of the record, because it is so out of step with the rest of the album. And I really, really love that song. Like, it's a timeless heavy metal riff. The engine is really there for that one, which really helps it, because, like, again, it's that Motorhead propelling it forward. It's what the songs, like, fucking 15 minutes either side of it don't have. And then James is, like, electric in that song, fucking full speed or nothing. I'm so there with it. And the thing I love in Metallica the most right now is when you can just feel Metallica love heavy metal, and so do I. And when James lifts his voice to that Lightning in the Nations, that is the most I fucking feel it. Maybe in their fucking career, I don't know, just in terms of, like, purely indulging in just the heavy metal mythos. And that is the thing that I am elated to have Metallica still delivering when they can. Like, it just fully rips and puts on display why heavy metal is awesome. I think where I disagree with you, Sam, where you said it kind of puts you on a high for the rest of the record, is obviously in brevity. I think you compare it to, like, the title track on Hardwired, which is on a record that has a lot more variety, that kind of, and that offers one part of a canvas. This is such a, like, blink and you'll miss it moment of this record, and then it goes right back into what it had just been doing not very well. It's like if you had one out-and-out banger and then loads of very similar mid-paced songs, and this just sort of, like, sparked up and then was snuffed out by something else. And that's where I think the sequencing either side of it suffers.
I think particularly following with Crown of Barbed Wire is the reason I'd maybe give that, but I do agree, because when you get that riff cuts in and it just takes off. I'm like, it's such a, like, lightning like in the middle of the record. But for me, because I just get such a good vibe off of Lux Eterna, and I think because it stands out so much, like you said, it's blinking missing, but it's so attention grabbing. You're not gonna, like, miss it. It's one of my favourite Metallica songs of, like, their kind of post, like, their sort of 21st century.
Yeah, absolutely. It's the moth into flame of this record. It's the one that you would go, that's fucking classic Metallica right there.
That should be in their set list until they stop touring from here on. Like, it's that good. But I still think there is generally just more I found catchy to the ear on the second art, sort of post Lux Eterna on the record, with, like, Crown of Barbed Wire probably being the low point post it. But other than that, there's not actually much in this back half of the record I dislike. I found it was just kind of like, this is, like, a good record for me at this point.
I really like Chasing Light. I think, like, it's one of the rare songs on this record where I think, you say this is the most redundant Metallica record, and I think you might be right, but this is one of the rare songs on the record where I think, I'm not sure I have heard Metallica do a song quite like this before. That's quite a unique riff for them. Hetfield, he very rarely sort of has those little vocal inflections, which they're kind of heartbreaking, hearing from someone who's...
He's really soulful on
it is, yeah, and
like...
we're accustomed to him being, you know, the arch general of the biggest metal band there's ever been. And yet, he manages to show vulnerability in a really inviting and emotionally affecting way. And I think, if nothing else, this song has a quality in that sense. It has something unique about it, which I've not heard them do, certainly not in the 21st century, and I don't think ever. It's one of the songs on this record that I think is most, or I say least redundant. It's one where if I was making a playlist, I'd go Chasing Light. That's one of the 72 Seasons tunes.
I think that is one of the main moments of what you're saying there, James vocally carrying an otherwise fairly mediocre thing. And I think that's what characterises the low points of this record, which I would put that among purely instrumentally. I think when you get into the back end of the record, when they are able to tap into a similar well of vigour to, like, Lux Eterna, is when you get, like, Too Far Gone and Room of Mirrors back to back. Too Far Gone's alright, like, it's not great, but it's only 4.5 minutes, which is, like...
big chorus.
Yeah, it's a reasonable time to subsist on such a 7 out of 10 riff, 4.5 minutes, so good, they got that one right there. Room of Mirrors, the dual harmonies at the end are one of my very favourite moments on the record. And that is such a much-needed burst of life before you get into the closing track. I wish the 4 minutes before it were a great song to match, which I don't think it is. It's just such a great bit to have in such like a 6 out of 10 song. But that bit really, just that and that how that, you know,
that is awesome. That bit.
Yeah, that really sparks me to life, and that's probably the second most hyped I get after Lux Eterna.
Like, I agree that's the best part of that song. I still think that's actually I like that song outside of that. I don't think it's outstanding, but I'm like, this is a good Metallica, sort of latter-day Metallica metal song that has that really great lead sort of dual harmonies bit.
Yeah, I mean, this song for me was a bit of a mix of like Spit Out the Bone and Lords of Summer without being dragged down too much by that latter tune. And for me,
I would put most of the song on a similar level to a Lords of Summer, which I always thought was fine. It just has an amazing spark of like joy at the end of it.
Yeah, and again, I think Hetfield, he sells the first half again, like particularly in the verses, I think melodically really strong. And to be honest, when I listen to a new Metallica record, I always want a couple moments where I can genuinely sort of shut off my brain and enjoy the euphoria of listening to a new Metallica record. And they're kind of few and far between, admittedly, but for me, the main one was when those harmonies came in. It was like I kind of shut off my critical faculties. I stopped thinking about how this song compared to the last song, how this compared to something off the last record, all of that stuff. And I was just able to enjoy it. And it's not necessarily the most radical thing. It's not the most ambidextrous, experimental thing, but it's sort of beautifully simple and well executed and well timed. And even this song, which is one of my favourites on the record, it has this weird riff tacked on the end for literally no reason. Metallica songs, in this part of their career, they're so often sold on moments, and this to me has one of the best ones on the record. So for me, it ranks very highly.
Yeah, I think when I'm talking about some of the lows on this record and what it goes for, I think part of it, as well as the songwriting and the lack of urgency, I think part of what you hear is, let's talk about the production on the record for a minute, because in my head, it's like it's carried on from Hardwire in the sense that the guitar tone and all those things are largely, you know, in a similar ballpark of where they've been for 15 plus years. But Hardwired fixed the problems that Death Magnetic had with, like, you know, the clipping and whatnot. But there is a different kind of problem that's been pointed out a lot, particularly I think with 72 Seasons this time around, hasn't there?
Yes. The drums are too loud. Too loud. Especially the hi-hat. Like, there are moments, and there's one which we still haven't gotten to yet, but there's moments where another instrument might have the opportunity to shine through, and it's just completely swamped by Ulrich's kit. And the drums have been too loud on Metallica records for a long time, but on this one, where the production is generally brighter than Hardwired, very similar but brighter, which I think is another point where you have the load-reload comparison, but it's not helped by having the drum kit so dominate the low end to the point where the bass doesn't get the opportunity to show what it's doing.
It's not just a volume issue. It's a kind of like precise within an inch of its life issue, which means like it has a very kind of clicky bass drum, and the snare is so like clean. It's like the same hit every single time. And then because of Lars's weird quirks as a drummer, he does those like awkward snare fills where he stops playing every other part of the kit and just goes like da 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 or something, and then goes back to play whatever the beat was. And because of the drum sound and how, as you're saying, in the mix it is, he almost sounds like a drum machine. He sounds like you've stopped and programmed those snare hits and stuff like that. And you know, again, Hardwired and then this, they fixed some of what was wrong specifically with Death Magnetic, but could it still be better to hear in just a metallic, a heavy metal band playing in full flight? Yeah, it could. I think, of course, the other job of the producer is the thing that Metallica don't feel like they've had since at least Load and Reload, if not the Black Album, which is to kind of crack the whip a bit when it comes to arrangements and keeping things focused, where Greg Fiedelman, the producer of Hardwire, engineered on Death Magnetic, he's become Metallica's guy. And to me, it feels very similar to the relationship that Iron Maiden have with Kevin Shirley, in that they're yes men. And they're at a point in their career when they don't really need anyone sticking their nose in, and you end up with records like The Book of Souls and Senjutsu from Iron Maiden. Those Maiden records, at least like Hardwired, did get the variety right. Like Senjutsu, I think, actually makes a much better use of a similar runtime than this does, and we had our criticisms of that when we reviewed it. But most songs on this feel like they go a couple minutes longer than they need to, which has been a problem since Saint Anger. but I think feels particularly prominent here because of how lethargically paced the songs actually are. Where, Screaming Suicide, I would have been kinder on as a standalone single had it been a minute or two shorter, and it's the third shortest track on this record.
Screaming Suicide is a great song of, like, if that was a 3-minute song, like 3.5 minutes, and they just kind of really tightened it to what it, like, its best parts, that'd be, I think, a much better song.
And then we were talking, particularly, I want to get back into what you were saying about the intros, because that, like, 50-second intro on Chasing Light before the riff locks in, I don't know what that's meant to make you feel, apart from it feels like Lars is fumbling about on his kit, getting his sticks ready to play the actual song. And they repeat this thing a lot, where most of the songs have some strange intro like that, almost for the sake of having one. And it just feels like you're listening to, like, Lars stab on the snare a few times before the song can be allowed to get going. They've gotten so stilted at those intros. And Elliot, what you were saying about the confidence and the sort of the feel of Metallica really fucking going for it playing, those are the kind of bits that really suck that out of this for me. And there's a bridge bit of Crown of Barbed Wire, which Mark described as sounding like that bit of the song is improv and they are stalling for time to come up with a good bit to then ride the rest out of the song on. Like, that kind of 3-4 minute mark of that song is the most lumpen and old I've maybe ever heard Metallica sound. And the overall song I think is okay, but my God, the way songs deviate into stuff like that for just like 2 minutes at a time, just fucking nonsense.
I don't necessarily mind the intros, feeling slightly useless. My problem with the intros in Metallica songs now is they seem hell-bent on doing this thing anytime a song is remotely mid-tempo, where they build the riff up from nothing, where it's like, start with the bass drum. I mean, If Darkness Had a Sun, which I think is broadly a good song, but the intro, just having it where it's like, just the bass, then the bass and the snare, then the bass and the snare, the rhythm guitar with the bass, and then have that, and then a lead line, which never comes back again, and then you can have the riff, and then we strip it back again.
A rock band game and having every player gradually pick up their fucking controller. Like, It Darkness Had a Sun, I think, is maybe my favourite of, like, the stompy type songs on this record.
The best of the mid-tempo ones, I'd say, yeah.
And, like, when I heard it as the third single, I thought, that's pretty good. And that's about where my opinion has stayed with it. The worst part of it is, as you're saying, it takes a while to really get into what it's doing, and it's kind of annoying. But, like, when it does get into what it's doing, it's one of the better songs on the record. Like, the riff is great, very Metallica. You want to bob your head to it. And I think, just to get back to what we were saying earlier as well, that is a great example of James being, like, getting something convincing out of something quite goofy. Because
If Darkness
Had a Sun, Here I Am is like a silly heavy metal sentiment, right? But from James and the way he embodies it, in this song, kind of dwelling in the darker side of his mind, temptation is his father, he's able to really sell it, and that really endears me to a song like that.
Yeah, I think that's on his performance to sell a line like that.
Yeah,
but,
at the very least, that groove has kind of intent behind it, as opposed to, again...
And he's able to sell verses which are a bit sort of cat in the hat, sat on the mat, it's that sort of thing. And it's like, with a less compelling vocal performance, that would just land incredibly awkwardly. But again, Hetfield, he sells huge swathes of this record, a lot of stuff which, in the hands of a lesser singer, or even a less confident James Hetfield, which we've heard a lot of in the past, I probably would assign it to, the latter Hardwired sort of tier material. But for me, Greg Fidelman, like, I think you're right that he's a yes man, and I think a lot of these bands, they mistake chemistry for people being yes men, in the way like Gary Sharon when he joined Van Halen, and Eddie Van Halen's like, we've never had better chemistry, and it's like, he just does whatever you say. That's not having chemistry. And Kevin Shirley, another example, and Greg Fidelman, it feels harsh to put him in that camp, but what I will say, he might not necessarily get great songs out of Metallica, but he can often get great performances, and especially out of James. I hear the complaints about Lars, like, I would like to have a bit more of a live feel in his performance, but at the same time, the last 25 years, Lars has been criticised for being too sloppy, and then he's slightly too robotic, and everyone goes, no, not that. It's like, I can see it's a tough situation.
This is a extreme quirk of me that I know not everyone will agree with. I would take the drum performance on Saint Anger, where he sounds like a mental fucking punk rock drummer who's slapped together a kit out of bits of his kitchen, over, like, programmed, almost sounding as he does on this, but is what it is. I think what we're saying about, Hetfield and his emotion and stuff like that, the reason I will not give songs like Chasing Light credit on this, and the thing that I think this dramatically has below certainly the previous couple records of Hardwired, and I think particularly Death Magnetic in this regard as well, is the unfortunate thing about the one-pacedness of the record. When you think about Confessional James lyrics, you obviously think about something like Mama Said, but even on the Black Album, there's like that gothic side to the record with, The Unforgiven, Wherever My Rate May Roam, My Friend of Misery, whatever. And his topics and his performances don't really get the musical texture that they deserve here. It's rare that you listen to a lengthy metal record and come out asking for there to be a ballad or two. But like I said, something like The Day That Never Comes, they strangely never actually venture into those territories on this record when the material really could benefit from it. And I think, James being brilliant can only get it so far when they are delivering undynamic songs again and again.
Yeah, I mean, looking at the track listing, for me, the real moment where I thought this could have been corrected was get rid of Crown of Barbed Wire, Luxor Turner goes out with a bang, and then you have something like The Day That Never Comes to follow that up, something longer, maybe a bit more expansive, a bit more progressive, all of that stuff. Yeah,
it does feel weird, like it feels like a jump almost in years to go from Luxor Turner, New Wave of British Heavy Metal, to Crown of Barbed Wire, which is more like a kind of load reload song. Like, it does feel like you should have something more, Sanitarium, Fade to Black-esque in between those things.
Yeah, it's a bit like lunch has ended, now it's time for maths. It's like... it's the sort of thing where you think, if you'd have done something, it's not necessarily Luxor Turner's brave, but equally bold, it wouldn't feel like such a drop. And the second half, kicking it off with something like that, I think would have been really smart. And then Chasing Light, which we've sort of disagreed on how good or bad that song is, I think that song would sound probably more invigorating, even to people who aren't that invigorated by it, if it came after something a bit more melodic and dynamic in that sense.
Yeah, I think it's a little melodically stunted overall, the record. Like, James sounds great, but so few of these songs actually feel like they've got great choruses to me. And I think back to just like Death Magnetic, and you've got All Nightmare Long, and That Was Just Your Life, and like Hardwired has Atlas Rise and Now That We're Dead. I don't know why this album feels so chorus shy, bar kind of Luxor Turner, 72 Seasons, and If Darkness Had a Sun. And then the big...
I think Too Far Gone's the other one that's...
Yeah,
it's a really basic chorus, but it does sound big at least.
That is decent, yeah. But again, not spectacular. And the big deviation moment in terms of texture is... if you've got a bunch of songs that sound like them doing kind of their Hardwired Death Magnetic sounds to its slowest, least rush degree, you get Inamorata at the very end, which is their longest song ever. They've pulled an Iron Maiden and knocked the Outlaw Torn into the history books in terms of length. Outlaw Torn found dead, and most reviews I've seen have highlighted this as like one of the obviously standout tracks on the record. I'm a few listens in now, and I kind of admire the song, but it isn't wowing me, and I've got some feelings as to why, and I've tried to pinpoint why that's the case.
So I think for me, I was kind of dreading like an 11-minute song on the end of this already quite long record, but to me, Inamorata feels shorter than like You Must Burn.
It feels shorter than You Must Burn do, that's for sure. Not sure.
Yeah, like it really does, and I'm like, there's actual thought in trying to actually write a grand kind of 11-minute opus as kind of like this big closing statement, and I don't think it's amazing in Inamorata, but I think there is stuff to admire about it in how it kind of approaches the length and where it kind of moves through the different passages. Again, I think a really, really strong Hetfield performance on that song again sells it, but it's not one I'm going to be rushing back to when I'm kind of done with my time with this record for a while. Like, it's when I can be like, that's cool, you did that as an impressive closing statement on the record, not like crazy about it.
Yeah, I was worried going into this one because I kind of thought it would be a Suicide Redemption sort of style dirge, which would just be incredibly boring and super tedious and would, negate all the goodwill I'd built up listening to this record. I'm in the camp. I think this is really good. Like, as a closer, I think it's pretty excellent. It reminds me a lot of Fixer, which I think is one of the most underrated Metallica songs ever. Great vocal harmonies and an actual tasteful use of repetition. Like, I know they lay into that riff loads, but just having small variations and like Kirk's solos and sort of blues jam inflections in Hetfield's performance, it means that each time the chorus comes in, it's not like they've just sort of copied and pasted. Life has been breathed into it. Yeah, I don't know. For me, this really worked. Like, the 11 minutes kind of flew by, which is mad considering it comes in 65, 66 minutes in to a record that we've all expressed problems with. Left me with a lot of goodwill at the end of the record. I think the final one of the songs is really strong.
I think this is lacking for me, some of the things you just pointed out there, and maybe they just really need to go even more to really sell it. But I think it's what it is. It's them going full Sabbath, right? Like the riff has kind of like a 90s stoner metal feel that feels like they're kind of like Caius or Sleep moment or something. But for the kind of importance it's given, it's not really great enough at that. And I think part of it is how little their kind of modern, crisp to within an inch of its life production sound allows for atmosphere. Where Load, when they lived in that zone before, is a very shadowy kind of record. And this sounds more like how Black Sabbath sounded on 13, for example. Like, you can recognise it as coming from that kind of well, but it has a kind of sterile photocopy of it feel. And I think it's a shame because Hetfield is so real on it. Like, that line, misery she fills me, but she's not what I'm living for. That is like James's moment of growth that concludes the whole record. Almost like it's giving an answer to, like, My Friends of Misery years before, like, moving past it emotionally. But that sort of push and pull feel, I think, is really lacking. There isn't enough life in the band to make that slow-paced 11-minute song feel all that much like it's worth it. And I think those kind of stoner tracks that really take their time, it's the dynamism in the band and the subtle, electricity of the players that really keeps them afloat. And I think stiff, Greg Fidelman-produced Metallica doesn't really have that, where Lars Ulrich sounds like he's Phil Rudding his way through almost all of that 11-minute song. And if you had Phil Rudd playing on Dope Smoker, it'd be rubbish. And I think it hits parts that are good, like the middle 8 part from around 6 minutes in, when James goes softer and the bass kind of moves up a little bit more to have some of that kind of geezery Electric Wizard, feel. That's when you start to feel like, oh yeah, this is the band that wrote Bleeding Me and stuff like that had that in them. And the ending solo goes into there for it is cool. I think it's more worthy experiment, I would categorize it as, than failure. But I think for an 11-minute song, it shows the things that the kind of thing they're drawing off this song have that they, in this particular point in their career, really don't. I mean, it's the kind of thing they tiptoed a bit into on Am I Savage, on Hardwired, and I think it shows that without the soul and a production that doesn't have the soul and murk of a Bleeding Me or whatever, Metallica now aren't designed to be a blues band, and you end up with a kind of 6 out of 10 energy level for most of the record, really.
Yeah, I get that. I think for me, the thing you were saying earlier about how the band never or rarely match Hetfield in terms of the sort of emotional weight, I think this is one of the moments where Hetfield and the band are in tandem, and I agree the production
Middle 8
still
is. I'm not sure the rest of it is.
Maybe I think like I agree the production stifles this song still. Like, I do wish it could kind of wander a bit more, and the push and pull is even more obvious than I think it is. But it feels like sort of the sky's opening at the end of a record that's been very, very much a bit of a downer, at least lyrically and in Hetfield's performance, if not the rest of the band. So having a song which is so kind of uplifting in that sense, partner with that bright production, I think it's actually a more tasteful combination than some of the less savoury moments earlier in the record.
Yeah, I think it as an emotional kind of arc of the record, I think it concludes it very well. I just wish there was more of that, like, again, atmosphere. It's such a bright production, and they're so stiff in the studio on this that I don't think it serves a song like that. And that brings me to, like, overall, for me, this album never hits a sustained level of quality like Disc 1 on Hardwired Self-Destruct. And where that record has its lows, I think the standard of those songs is about where most of 72 Seasons hits, not just kind of the couple that feel like outliers at the bottom of the barrel. The proportion of great to not great has been flipped, if you like. Like, if we were to say that Hardwired is about 2/3 great, this flips that. But I fucking love Luxor Turner, and I really like 72 Seasons, If Darkness Had a Sun, Shadows Follow, that guitar melody bit at the very end of Room of Mirrors. I'd be happy with those in a live set. Granted, I would be less happy about, Chasing Light or You Must Burn or whatever, but, like, there is great material on this.
Yeah, I think that's generally why I've come down. Again, we slightly differ on what we think the great material is outside of, like, say, 72 Seasons, Lux Turner, and If Darkness Had a Sun. But I do still think there is more to this record that is, like, Jimmy Gooden, and it kind of shows at moments where, like, that's why we like, Metallica are still the biggest band in metal, when they kind of do just strike that magic where, like, everyone's kind of like, oh, you just listen to XYZ band now, and I'm like, yeah, but sometimes they can't hit on something that, like, Metallica can. That just is why we love them still, and there is enough of that on there for me, and enough stuff that is, like, good at the very least, even if it is not really great and exciting, that I can still have a worthwhile experience with this. I just think tightening it up, cutting down, trimming the fat on it, and just fix I think the problem is this record are quite easily fixable because they're invisible. That you go, there's a version of this record that I think could be really great, and I think they just miss the mark on it and just lose themselves. And when a record that is good but doesn't live up to its own potential.
Yeah, I agree that the problems on this record being so fixable makes it even more frustrating when you just go, you could have cut that off, you could have fixed that production thing, like,
which is exactly that's the problem that Metallica have for 20 years, right? This isn't new.
Well, this is it.
Yeah, no, it's not. No, like,
this is it. It's what you go in expecting, and like you say, if you compare it to modern metal bands or even the thrash bands they came up with, yeah, it doesn't succeed on that level. That's not the camp I put Metallica in. I think I like this record more than both of you, and I don't know if it's necessarily just down to framing. I'm not sure if we all frame it the same way, but for me, I'd think of something like the last couple of AC/DC records, whether the Who have done, U2, that sort of thing, and you think...
I think, just in terms of why we feel differently, I think it's because Metallica have a higher bar in recent memory than those bands. Like, 2/3 of Hardwired I think is great. I love most, if not all, of Death Magnetic. The fucking Who haven't done anything like that in however long. I think that's actually being a little bit cruel on Metallica's history.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, I guess it depends which way you want to frame it. For me, I just think of rock bands of a certain size. There's more eyes on them. There's more pressure. And Metallica, more than maybe any of those bands, experience pressure. Maybe other than U2, who no one seems to like. But for me, it's like they're kind of in uncharted territory. So maybe I'm willing to give them a bit more sort of rope than some people are. I'm not sure. I'm not saying that about either of you two. But for me, listening to this, I just think 42 years in, I really like about half this record. There's some good stuff in even the songs I'm not so keen on. And yeah, there's Crown of Barbed Wire, which I do think is a real dud. But that's about as much as I could have possibly expected. So I'm not coming away from this really disappointed at all, other than the fact that there isn't a high as something on either of the last two records.
Yeah, I think for me, like almost like if you said you really like about half this record, I'm probably approaching something similar.
I think I'm the same as well.
Yeah,
like,
I think what it is I am actually holding Metallica to a higher bar than that. I'm not giving them the okay. And to be to be clear, I'm not actually damning them for that, because I am going, if I like fucking half of an 80-minute record, that's 40 minutes of Metallica bangers.
That's the whole record.
Yeah, that I'm into. So like I'm fine with that. Really, I'm taking this record as it is. I'm going, realistically, what is the quality level on it? I think it's, again, 2/3 to half of the record being slightly mediocre and some real shining moments in it. Like we led into this very long review saying, does that actually matter? Does that cast any particular assuasion or whatever onto Metallica's state? Not fucking at all. They're Metallica, right? They are where they are. I'm just taking this as what will I take from this record going forward? And I think it is, some of it's really good and a fair bit of it is not very good. And luckily, we are in a position where we don't actually need to rely on Metallica to be making the best records for us to have a good time, right? Like, there's loads of great heavy bands out there. Just this last Friday, when this came out, there's a really direct heavy metal album that I love in the shape of that Smolder album, and a 70-minute progressive journey that keeps its runtime engaging with new and brilliant ideas in the Dodd Heimsgard record.
And if you want a fresh album that's going to rip your face off, you've got Enforced coming next week.
Yeah, and then today, like a week after the album's release, today, there's a new Grave Pleasures album that I'm going to be wanting to listen to all the time, and every song on that is a banger. So I don't need that much replayability from the Metallica album overall. What I need is some stuff that makes me happy, and for them to be making themselves happy.